The air outside the grand entrance of the Waldorf Astoria crackled with a specific kind of energy. Standing sentinel at the foot of the short, red-carpeted steps leading into the lobby was Frank. Frank wasn't just a security guard. In his own mind, he was the first line of defense, the gatekeeper. He'd been doing this job for 15 years, and in that time, he'd developed an almost supernatural ability to size people up, to spot the bluffers, the hangers-on, the ones who didn't belong. His eyes, hard and cynical, scanned every approaching figure, looking for the subtle cues of status, the cut of a suit, the confidence in a step, the flash of an easily produced high-level credential. He took a grim satisfaction in turning away the pretenders, in exercising his small, temporary power over those who thought money or a fancy suit alone could get them anywhere. Then he saw him, walking slowly, deliberately, up the sidewalk towards the perimeter. The man was of African descent, and his attire, while neat, was unremarkable. A simple dark suit, a plain tie, shoes that looked comfortable rather than fashionable. He wasn't flanked by an entourage, wasn't talking animatedly on a phone, wasn't puffing out his chest with obvious importance. He simply walked, his hands clasped loosely behind his back, his expression calm and observant, taking in the scene without appearing impressed or intimidated. Frank's internal alarm bells didn't just ring, they clanged. Not one of ours, his gut instinct screamed. Too quiet, too plain, no swagger. He looked like an ordinary guy who had perhaps wandered into the wrong neighborhood, let alone the wrong event. As the man reached the edge of the perimeter, Frank stepped forward, his posture stiffening, his hand raising slightly, a universally understood signal to stop. His face settled into the neutral mask of authority, but his eyes held that familiar glint of skepticism, already dismissing the man before a single word was exchanged. "Hold up there, sir," Frank said, his voice flat, carrying just enough volume to be heard over the distant city noise and the low murmur of the crowd. "Can I help you?" The phrase was polite, but the tone implied the opposite. It was a challenge, a soft, "What do you think you're doing here?" The man stopped a few feet away. He offered Frank a small, polite smile. It wasn't a nervous smile or a fake one, just polite. "Good evening," the man replied, his voice calm, measured, and even, with a distinct, gentle African accent that Frank couldn't immediately place. "I believe I am expected for the reception." Expected? That phrase, again, Frank had heard it a million times, used by everyone from delivery drivers trying to bypass the queue to minor celebrities, hoping their C-list status was enough. It was the go-to phrase for people trying to bluff their way past him. His skepticism deepened instantly, solidifying into outright suspicion and a growing sense of disdain. This guy wasn't even trying very hard. Expected by who, exactly? Frank asked, his tone turning visibly cooler, more challenging, laced with patent disbelief. He crossed his arms over his chest, a clear signal of dismissal. "Do you have an official invitation? A credential with your name on it? Something I can verify against the official guest list for the summit?" He emphasized official and summit, stressing the high-stakes nature of the event and, by extension, his own importance in controlling access to it. The man didn't flinch, didn't shuffle his feet, didn't look down. He maintained his calm posture, his gaze steady as it met Frank's. There was no trace of embarrassment or frustration in his expression. "My name is Ibrahim Traoré," he stated clearly, his voice quiet but firm. "I am listed." Ibrahim Traoré. Frank ran the name through his mental Rolodex of VIPs, dignitaries, and on-site personalities he'd been briefed on. Nothing. Didn't ring a bell. Wasn't a recognizable face from finance, tech, politics, or major entertainment that he tracked. The name sounded distinctly foreign, certainly, but not like a name that belonged to the kind of person who arrived unaccompanied and in such unassuming attire at a global summit reception at the Waldorf Astoria. Frank felt a wave of smug certainty wash over him. Gotcha. Another pretender. He allowed himself a small internal smirk. He repeated the name, drawing it out slightly as if tasting something bitter or unpleasant on his tongue. "Traoré," he said, his voice dripping with skepticism. He let his eyes do another slow, dismissive sweep of the man's unremarkable suit, from his tie to his shoes. "And who, pray tell, are you associated with tonight, Mr. Traoré? Which government? Which international body? Which delegation?" His tone was openly mocking now, daring the man to come up with a plausible lie. "Because, frankly, based on what I'm seeing," he gestured vaguely at the man's clothes, "you don't exactly scream international dignitary here. for a major summit. He wasn't just questioning his credentials, he was actively questioning his very right to be there, based solely on appearance and the absence of the usual trappings of power he was accustomed to seeing. This was the part Frank sometimes enjoyed the most, cutting people down to size, using his uniform and his position as a scalpel to reveal what he perceived as their true, insignificant status. The man, Ibrahim Traoré, remained unfazed. His small smile didn't waver, but there was something in his eyes now. A quiet understanding, perhaps, of the guard's mindset, a deep well of patience that Frank mistook for either cluelessness or stubbornness. It wasn't defiance, but it wasn't submission either. This unwavering calm, this refusal to show any sign of being flustered or intimidated, only seemed to fuel Frank's mounting arrogance and frustration. Why wasn't this guy wilting like the others? "I am here on my own behalf," the man replied again, his voice still remarkably calm, level, and utterly devoid of the expected nervousness or evasiveness. Frank felt a surge of genuine irritation now, mixed with a growing certainty that this man was being deliberately difficult, perhaps as some kind of bizarre prank or a highly incompetent attempt to sneak in. He was definitely trying to pull a fast one, and Frank wasn't having it. He took another step closer, invading the man's personal space slightly, lowering his voice, but injecting it with pure, unadulterated contempt and a thinly veiled threat. "Listen, pal," Frank said, leaning in slightly, his eyes hard and cold. "Let's cut the crap. I've been standing here all night dealing with real VIPs. I know who's supposed to be here and who isn't. You don't have the look. You don't have the credentials that mean anything here." He gestured dismissively at the man with his chin. "And frankly, you're wasting my time." He was ready to deliver his final dismissal, to order the man away, but something in the man's calm, steady gaze stopped him for a second. The man wasn't backing down. He wasn't showing any fear. Then, Ibrahim Traoré did something unexpected. He didn't produce a badge, didn't name-drop a contact. He simply looked Frank directly in the eye and spoke, his voice quiet, clear, and utterly serious. "Sir, I understand your diligence," he said, his voice carrying a quiet authority that felt out of place coming from someone Frank had already dismissed. "However, there is no misunderstanding. I am Ibrahim Traoré." He paused, and then stated, clearly and unequivocally, "I am His Excellency, the President of Burkina Faso." Frank stared at him. He waited for a punchline. He waited for a smirk, a wink, something to indicate this was a joke. It didn't come. The man's face remained calm, his gaze steady. Frank felt a burst of something akin to disbelief so profound it was comical. A president? This guy? Standing here in his plain suit by himself, looking like he was waiting for a bus? It was the most ridiculous, audacious bluff Frank had ever encountered in his 15 years on the job. It wasn't just a lie. It was an insult to his intelligence, a mockery of the very event they were protecting. A harsh, barking laugh erupted from Frank's throat, loud enough to make some onlookers jump and other security personnel turn their heads. He couldn't help it. The sheer absurdity of the claim struck him as hilarious. "You?" Frank roared, stepping back slightly, throwing his head back in laughter. "You're a president? Of where? Your apartment building's Residents Association." He laughed harder, pointing a finger at Traoré. "Come on, buddy. Do you really think that's going to work? Oh, excuse me. I'm the president of blah blah land. Let me just wander in." His laughter was joined by a few nervous, uncertain chuckles from some of the onlookers, who were now fully captivated by the spectacle. Other security guards exchanged uneasy glances, but none intervened. Frank was known for being tough. Maybe this was just how he handled the really persistent ones. Wiping a tear of mirth from his eye, Frank straightened up, his face hardening again, but his eyes still held a glint of mocking amusement. "Look, pal," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "That's the single worst bluff I've ever heard. Absolutely pathetic." Then, as if anticipating the man's next move might be to reach for a fake ID or pull out some poorly forged document, Frank added, leaning in again, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper filled with menace. "Don't waste my time with fairy tales. You want to play games? Claiming to be a president is a good way to get yourself in serious trouble. We can call the real authorities. See how they feel about you impersonating a head of state." He puffed out his chest again, emphasizing his uniform, his authority. The man, still calm, still met his gaze. "Sir," he said, his voice even quieter now, but with an almost imperceptible weight to it, "it is the truth. If you require verification, you are welcome to contact the protocol office for this event. Or, he added simply, you could check online. My name and position are readily available information. Frank stared at him, momentarily taken aback by the man's continued composure and the suggestion of easy verification. But his deeply ingrained skepticism, his 15 years of spotting fakes, and his absolute conviction that this unassuming man simply could not be who he claimed, overrode any flicker of doubt. He saw the suggestion to check online, not as a genuine offer, but as another transparent, desperate tactic from someone who knew he was caught in a lie. What kind of president told a security guard to Google him? It was absurd. I check online? Frank scoffed again, a shorter, sharper sound this time, full of renewed contempt. He threw his hands up slightly in exasperation. Are you serious? You think I have time to sit here playing on my phone while I'm on duty, protecting a multi-million-dollar event? Against people like you, he gestured dismissively. That's the lamest excuse I've ever heard. Just Google it. Unbelievable. His patience had completely run out. This wasn't just a trespasser. This was a nuisance, an arrogant, persistent liar who was now trying to make a fool of him publicly. Frank felt a surge of anger. He was going to end this now. He took a step forward, reaching out firmly to grab the man's arm, intending to turn him around and physically steer him away from the entrance. All right, that's it, Frank said, his voice hard and final. You've had your chance. You need to leave. Now! He exerted pressure, intending to force the man to move. Just as Frank's hand closed around Ibrahim Traoré's arm, intending to remove him by force, a sudden, powerful wave of energy surged through the entrance area. A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. A different kind of professionalism, sharper, more urgent, emanated from a newly arrived group. A sleek black limousine, longer and more imposing than the others, had pulled up with swift precision. The door opened, and out stepped a figure whose face was instantly recognizable to everyone present, and whose arrival always commanded immediate respect. It was Senator Evelyn Reed, her expression serious and commanding, already surveying the scene with an expert eye. Behind her moved a larger, more highly trained security detail than the standard. Okay, let's find a middle ground. Longer than the very brief summary, but more concise than the first extensive version. This segment will focus on the emotional core of the reveal and Frank's immediate, desperate reaction. Frank's hand closed around Ibrahim Traoré's arm, intending to turn him and physically escort him away. All right, that's it, Frank said, his voice hard and final. You've had your chance. You need to leave. Now! He felt the man's arm, surprisingly solid, as he began to apply pressure. Just as Frank began to exert force, a sudden, sharp intake of breath rippled through the onlookers behind the rope line. A distinct, urgent energy shifted near the curb. A sleek black limousine, larger than the others, had pulled up, and from it emerged a figure whose presence instantly commanded the attention of everyone present. Senator Evelyn Reed. Her face was set with purpose, her eyes scanning the scene with an experienced, discerning gaze. Senator Reed did not head for the hotel entrance. Her gaze swept over the perimeter, then stopped abruptly, fixing on the small standoff occurring between Frank and the unassuming man. A look of immediate recognition, followed by profound surprise, and then a chilling dismay, flashed across Senator Reed's features. She saw the man Frank was holding, and the casual grip on his arm seemed to visibly outrage her. Without a moment's hesitation, she changed direction, walking briskly, purposefully, directly towards where Frank stood blocking the man's path. Her security detail, momentarily startled, adjusted their formation and followed, moving with a sudden serious urgency that signaled something far beyond standard protocol. Frank, startled by the unexpected rapid approach of the powerful senator, released Traoré's arm instinctively. His arrogant smirk faltered, replaced by a puzzled frown. What did Senator Reed want? Was she here to complain about him, or did she know the man? Senator Reed reached the perimeter line, standing directly beside Frank, her attention solely on the unassuming figure before them. Frank stood rooted to the spot, suddenly feeling awkward and immense in his uniform. The senator's gaze, usually directed at heads of state and genuine global icons, was fixed with intense focus on the man he had just mocked and tried to throw out. Then, in a gesture that stole the breath from every lung within earshot, Senator Reed inclined her head deeply. It was a bow of profound respect, an act rarely, if ever, witnessed by Frank from a figure of her stature in public. She extended her hand towards the man, Mr. President, Senator Reed's voice rang out, clear and strong, cutting through the sudden, stunned silence that had fallen over the entire entrance area outside the Waldorf Astoria. Her voice resonated with undeniable respect. Mr. President Traore, on behalf of my government, welcome. We have been anticipating your arrival. Mr. President. The two words landed like a seismic shockwave. Frank's heart lurched violently in his chest, a sickening jolt. His blood ran cold, a rush of icy dread. His vision seemed to tunnel, focusing solely on the calm face of the man he had just called pal, mocked, accused of lying, and was moments away from physically assaulting. Mr. President. The unassuming man in the simple suit, the man who didn't have the look, who didn't scream international dignitary, who he had told was in the wrong place, was Ibrahim Traoré. President Ibrahim Traoré. Frank's mind reeled, struggling to compute the impossible contradiction. The confident arrogance he had felt moments before evaporated, as if it had never existed, replaced by a tidal wave of pure, unadulterated horror, shame, and absolute gut-wrenching dread. He had been rude, condescending, publicly insulting, and physically aggressive towards a head of state, a president, in front of a powerful U.S. senator, and countless witnesses, many now openly gasping or whispering. He felt his face drain of all color, turning a ghastly pale white. The weight of his uniform suddenly felt crushing, a heavy, ridiculous, and utterly damning symbol of the authority he had so spectacularly misused. His hand, which had just held the president's arm, now trembled uncontrollably. He looked wildly from President Traoré, who stood calm and composed, to Senator Reed, whose face was grim and disapproving, to the stunned faces of his colleagues and the onlookers, all staring at him with disbelief and dawning comprehension. The magnitude of his error crashed down on Frank with overwhelming, sickening force. He hadn't just made a social blunder. He had committed a monumental international incident. His job, his career, his reputation, everything he had built, everything he thought he was, felt utterly obliterated in that single terrible moment. He had let his blind prejudice and petty power trip lead him to commit professional, possibly diplomatic suicide. His knees felt weak, threatening to give out. A strangled sob caught in his throat. The arrogance and anger that had fueled his actions just moments before dissolved into a desperate, crippling remorse. He couldn't stand there, rigid and authoritative anymore. The facade was impossible to maintain, driven by a sudden, overwhelming, almost primal need to try and somehow undo the irreparable damage, to beg for a reprieve from the inescapable consequences. Frank stumbled forward slightly. Ignoring the protocol, ignoring his supervisor's frantic, whispered calls of his name, ignoring everything but the burning shame and the desperate need for forgiveness, he dropped to his knees. His knees hit the cold pavement of the red carpet with a sharp jolt. But in the overwhelming storm of emotion, he barely registered the pain. He clasped his hands together, his body trembling uncontrollably, and looked up at President Traoré, his face contorted with raw anguish and profound, desperate remorse. Tears welled in his eyes and spilled down his cheeks. "Mr. President!" Frank choked out, his voice thick with emotion, barely audible above the sudden buzz of the crowd, a stark contrast to the aggressive tone he had used moments before. "Oh God, Mr. President, I am so sorry. Please, please forgive me!" The words tumbled out, a raw, incoherent torrent of shame, panic, and self-recrimination. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know who you were. I was wrong. I was a fool. I abused my authority. I mocked you. I begged you to Google me and still didn't believe. Please, sir, please forgive me. I beg you. My job, everything. I'm so sorry." President Traoré looked at him for a long moment, his gaze steady and discerning. He saw not just the uniform or the job title, but the man beneath, humbled and broken by his own actions. "We all carry biases," President Traoré said, his voice calm, almost conversational, yet carrying immense weight. "Sometimes those biases prevent us from seeing the truth, even when it stands before us." He paused, then added, his gaze encompassing the scene. "You doubted because I did not fit the picture you had in your mind. Appearance can be deceiving. Learn from this," he concluded, his voice gentle but firm. "Learn to see more clearly." Despite the gravity of the insult and attempted physical removal, in that quiet moment, President Traoré extended a profound, unsolicited act of forgiveness. His quiet grace acknowledged the kneeling guard's desperate plea, offering mercy where none was required. Then President Traore turned his full attention back to Senator Reid, offering her a composed, polite nod. "Shall we proceed, Senator?" he said, as if the preceding minutes of dramatic confrontation and desperate pleading had been merely a brief pause.